We're now in Daf Yud Beis Amid Beis, and we're trying to reconcile two statements of Rebbe with regard to Mitzon v'Ashba Shebabayis. Hachi Kamer. Here's what Rebbe says: Nirim Divrei Rabbi Yehuda li Rabbi Chanina beno shel Rabbi Yossi Aglili v'Ashba Shebashuk. Meaning that even Rabbi Chanina, who was the Mekil, accepted the reasoning that underlies the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, namely that if you find it in the ashpa, then even Rabbi Chanina would agree to Rabbi Yehuda that if it's ashpa shebashuk, for sure it was thrown out of there because it was nevela. The shechita was not a proper shechita. She'af Rabbi Chanina b'no Rabbi Yossi Aglili lo nechak olav ela bi ashpa shebabayis. When was Rabbi Chanina the mekil? And he said you can eat the meat. That's only if you find it in the house, in the trash can. Aval bi ashpa shebashuk modile. Now we understand Rebbe. Rebbe says, Nirim, I accept Rabbi Chanina as being very reasonable in the case where he found it in the Ashpa Shebabayis. Meaning, although Rabbi Chanina was modeh in the case of Ashpa Shebashuk, and he accepted and embraced the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that we have to assume it's Nevela, and that's why it was dumped out there. However, where is the machlokes, and when did Rabbi Chanina reject Rabbi Yehuda and was mekil? That's in Ashpa Shebabayis. That far Rabbi Yehuda was not willing to go. He was not willing to be mekil in Ashpa Shebabayis. He was only willing to accept a kula in the case of bayis mamish. And now when Rebbe says Nirim Divrei Reb Chanina, etc., what he's saying is that I'm going to accept Reb Chanina in his machlokes with Rabbi Yehuda regarding Ashpa Shebabayis. Okay, Rabbi, so at this point we really go back to the Mishnah and we're sort of, so to speak, starting from scratch. The Mishnah says, Hakol ksherim l'shchita, kol shotim, chutz v'cheri shot v'kotan, shemi yikalkul l'shchinosa. Right? These are three people that don't have das, three categories, and we don't rely on them for shchita. Now, the language of the Mishnah in the future tense, Shema Yekalkalu, is like a stick in the side, a thorn in the side of the Gemara. Shema Kilkalu lo Ketani el Shema Yekalkalu. I mean, the Mishnah is talking about a case where a Cheir Shot V'Katan stood up to the plate, they meant the Shechita, and now the question is, can we eat the animal, the meat of the animal after the Shechita? So why did the Mishnah choose to use Shema Yekalkalu in the future? My Rav is also nice in order to teach us Ein Mosalem L'Chul L'Chatchila. That even in the case of Chullin, which is not as severe as Kodshim, we're not going to allow Cheir Shot V'Katan to do the Shechita. Even if there's a Gadol Omen Al Gabov, that's a fallback position. B'di'evet. Okay, Rabbi, say now we start the sugya of Kavana B'Shechita. Now this sugya, just by way of introduction, breaks down into many, many different subparts. One division is Kodshim versus Chulin. And it could very well be that even if Kavana, L'Shem Shchita, is not necessary and required in the case of Chulin, it might still be required in the case of Kodshim. The second dimension of the sugya is that those three categories of individuals who are lav b'nei deoninu, they don't have das, they don't have kavanah. You and I might have said, okay, they don't have das, but they have kavanah. But the third part of this sugya is that maybe we could prove that even, we're going to choose katan, but it's the truth for cherish and katan, even the katan might have kavanah. that's halakhically accepted in certain very rare cases. So let's go through. Man tana de lo be'ina kavana l'shchita. Meaning, if they don't have das, they don't have kavana. If they don't have kavana, how could their shchita be kosher? So this Mishnah that says that we can rely on the shchita of a cherim if we know he did a good shchita because they're acherim, they're supervisors, that assumes that you don't need kavana because the cotton is not capable of kavana. The Gemara is going to give a case where you took a knife, a sword or a knife, you threw it against the wall, and it hit the top neck of an animal, bounced off the wall, and then cut it a second time. That's called molech umevi. No kavan over here. You were just throwing a knife. It's like throwing darts at a dartboard. Amar Rava. Rava has a tradition in the name of Rav Oshia of a certain brisa that records a machlok between Rabbi Nosson and the Chacham. And Rabbi Nosson is the one who holds that lo be'ina kavana, and that would justify the ruling of our Mishnah that if cherishot v'kotin v'gadol min agabav, then we can rely on the shchita. Why? Because the cotton is capable of kavan. Or, alternatively, we don't need kavan. Tani Oshia Zeira min Chavraya. Okay, he was the youngest one amongst his academy. Zorak sakin l'noat. Right, he's playing darts with a sakin, with a knife. V'halach v'shachta kidarka. Again, we have to add, as the Gemara will add soon, I'm just anticipating, that it bounced off the wall and it was molech umevi. It went in both directions. Rabbi Nosson machshir can eat from the meat. Where is the kavanah? Chachamim poslim. No kavanah. His intention was, to play dart games. Now, this Rabbi Oshia not only brings the brisa to our attention, but he also interprets the brisa. Hu tani lahu amar. Halacha Rabbi Nosson. Now, I'm not sure why. Normally, we have a principle of Yochid v'Rab Malacha Kerabah, but here, for some reason, Oshia says that we paskin like Rabbi Nosson, and the shchita is valid even without kavanah. I find something very strange here. Maybe, guys, you can help me with this. Our Mishnah doesn't mention any bar plukta. It just says that cherishat v'katan, right? What's the language in the future tense? Right, Shemi Kalkalu, but right, let's go back to the first Mishnah for a second. But if they shechted, Vacherim Roman also ksherim. Right. It says v'kulim sheshachtu, Vacherim Roman also shchitas on ksherim. Or what happened to kavanah? Okay, Rabbi Nosson. Yeah, but our Mishnah is against the Chachamim. I don't know. I mean, logically, I would have said that the Acherim Roanos, they're going to supply the kavod, but they don't do the Ma'aser Shchitas. I don't know if you could separate one Gavra does the Ma'aser Shchita, the other Gavra supplies the kavod. Frekti Gemara, V'be'inim Olechu Mevi, right? Shchita is only in both directions. And the Gemara answers, Shaholchu Ba Kedarka. I'd love to see this in a video. Imagine throwing a knife against the wall, cuts the two simonim of the animal, and then it bounces back and cuts it the other direction. I don't know. It's like a very strange feat. And he wasn't even interested in shchita. Okay. Now, Rabbosai, remember I told you that this sugya divides up into Chullin and Kachin. So right at this point, at this juncture, we're going to move to Kachin. Amar Rab Chia bar Abba, boy Rabbi Yochanan. Katan yesh lo machshavo, ein lo machshav. Now, until this point, we've been assuming that a katan is a la bardas and he's not capable of kavana. But now we get to kachim, and two changes are made here. All of a sudden, the word kavana is replaced by the word machshava. And secondly, all of a sudden, in Rabbi Yochanan's frame of reference, vacillating back and forth, there's a possibility that katan does have machshava. Now, I'm tempted to think, but when I think about it, it's too radical, that maybe Rabbi Yochanan has in mind that in Kachim, you don't need kavan. All you need is machshav. Because if you recall from the first mission of Maseches Zvachim, if the Kohen shechted the carbon shalol lishma, the carbon is still kosher. Now again, you'll argue shalol lishma doesn't have anything to do with us. We're not talking about whether it's shlomim l'shem ola l'shem so many of that. We're talking about whether they had kavana for shchita. But maybe, just maybe, that Mishnah indicates that with regard to kachim, the fact that the animal is a carbon, let's call it an ola, that itself determines, or I don't know what word to use, but bounces back onto the shchita and defines the shchita. Meaning the intent or purpose of the shchita is not determined by the mind of the Kohen HaShochet, but rather by the carbon itself. In brisket terminology, we would say the cheft of the carbon, rather than machshavas hagav. So it could be that in Kodshim, maybe a katan would be acceptable, whereas in Chulin he would not. Anyway, Omolei Rabbi Ami. So this question was raised by Rabbi Chia bar Abba, no, I'm sorry, maybe I made a mistake here. Rabbi Chia bar Abba was only reporting the question that Rabbi Yochanan raised, and now Rabbi Ami is going to respond to Rabbi Yochanan's question. And he asks him, V'tiboile maisa. Why is it, Rabbi Yochanan, you're only asking a question about the kavanah of a katan? You should be asking a more far-reaching question, or shall I say a more inclusive question, and a more complicated question. Because even if I grant you that a katan doesn't have kavanah, but he has a maisa, and maybe that maisa will determine his kavanah. Again, the language here that I'm using falls short. It cannot determine his kavanah. He doesn't have kavanah, but it's almost like a replacement, a substitute for kavanah. Like, for example, I'm just a little bit running ahead of ourselves here because we're okay with the clock. In Kvi Hashem Kli, what am I talking about? In the laws of Tuv V'Tara, a Kli, which is not raw materials, but rather a fully flash manufactured Kli, is Makabel Tum. If, on the other hand, it's not ready to be used, we'll call it raw materials, then it's not a Kli, and it's not Makabel Tum. But let's say you had the raw materials in front of you, and Ploni Almoni, who's a gadol, he says, I'm going to use this to make a kli. So he's got clay and he's fashioning a utensil out of clay. Then it would be makabel tum. What about a katan? And the question of a katan now is a twofold question. Number one, whether the machshava, the katan, if he decides, you know what, this is going to be a kli, whether that's meaningful. And moreover, if the katan actually goes ahead and fashions the kli, then the katan has a maisa, and then for sure he could generate a shem kli and it's makabel too. Anyway, so the Gemara says the following: Maishno maisa deloka boile. Why is it that Rabbi Yochanan, when he asked this question, he only asked about machshava? He should have asked about maisa. Desnan yesh lahem maisa. Now, where is this Mishnah in Caleb? That means that the maisa of a katan could create the shem kli. But what about the machshava, which hasn't yet, in Hebrew we say letzeit lepol, hasn't yet materialized itself in the maisa, in the creation of the kli? Tisnan. Ha'ilon va'rimon va'egos. Okay, so these are different types of fruits and nuts that you can, it's called chakika. How do you say it in English? To hollow them out. And when you hollow them out, they function as a kli, as a utensil. Become like measuring. Shochachakam tinokos lomid b'hem afar. The children, they want to make sand dunes or whatever you call it. They're playing with the sand. So they hollow out this acorn for the purpose of putting sand inside. Oh, alternatively, hiskinum lekaf maznayim. The children punctured the shell, emptied its contents through the hole. They made the shell into a toy to measure sand, or to the pan, made it into a scale. Tmeim. To our surprise, the Mishnah says that this kli, which was manufactured by a katan, has a shem kli and it's makabel tumah neishiesh lahem maisa. Meaning the maisa of a katan is a chal shem maisa. Again, I wouldn't go too far with this. I don't think that a maisa of a katan is really a chal shem maisa, except for the case of shem kli for kabbalah's tumah. He says here the following: although a minor's declared intent is in and of itself insignificant, still it has legal significance when accompanied by an act that shows his intent. You follow, we're integrating Maisa with Machshava. And therefore, based on this ruling in the Mishnah, I can understand why Rabbi Yochanan only asked about Machshava in the case of a katan. He wouldn't have asked about a Maisa, because we see clearly from this Mishnah, Rabbi Yochanan, no doubt about it, that if the Maisa of the katan is chal, then it determines or generates a machshava even in a katan. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan could only ask his question with regard to machshava, but not with regard to ma'isa. And here on the top of Yud Gimel, the ein lahem machshava, even though the ma'isa of a katan is valid, but machshava without ma'isa is not valid. So if that be the case, if the Mishnah in Kalim is saying that the only reason why the katan could effectuate something that requires machshava is only because he did a ma'isa, so why did Rabbi Yochanan vacillate about the machshava of a katan? Clearly, ein lehem machshava. Amalei, so Chia tells Rav Ami, machshava greidasa lo kami baile. Rabbi Yochanan understood very well from the Mishnah in Kalim that the machshava katan doesn't register, has no legal significance. Ki kami baile, what was Rabbi Yochanan vacillating about? Machshav toni keres mitoch ma'isa, where he does an action that in the objective world indicates his machshava. So even though his machshava per se is not sufficient, but his action could be. Like, for example, go to Havikaima Ola B'Tarom, Aisu B'Tzofra Shchata. You have a carbon Ola, and it was located in the Darom, and as we learned many times in Zvachim, the shchita of an Ola has to be B'Tzofra, and now the child takes the animal from Darom over to Tzofan. Why did he do that? Obviously, he did it because he wants to have a shchitas korban ola. And therefore, Rabbi Yochanan wants to know, can we say that the machshava of the katan, although it doesn't register, but if it's proven and established objectively by a maisa, do we say mida asya mitzafon v'shachat, since the child transported the animal, the ola, from the south over to the north and shechted it? Ichavile. Again, ichavile is a very tricky language here because the katan doesn't have kavana, but it means it's the kavana of the maisa. Very complicated combination. Because again, machshava greda lo kami boile ki kam boy machshavto nikeres mitoch maisa. It's almost as if machshava is in the subjective world, which is called, by the way, I'm showing my knowledge in philosophy, is called phenomenology, if you heard of Husserl. And it's based on Descartes, of course. But now we're talking about something totally different. We're talking about Maisa, which exists in the objective world, if we reject Descartes. O Dilma, Makom Hu Delo Isrami Le. Lois Ramile, he wanted this child, minor, wanted to shech the animal in the Doro. Couldn't find a place for himself. There was so much shechita going on, so he took the animal over to the Tzafon. But basically, the Gemara is saying that if we were convinced that the reason why, there was no other explanation for it, the child took the carbon, the olah, from the Tzafon, from the Daram to the Tzafon, is only because of the shechita of the carbon, then it's machshav toni keres mitoch ma'isa. And Rabbi Yochanan wants to know if that could generate a chal shem machshava when there's no machshava, but it's ma'isa shemochichem es machshavt. All right, so we'll stop here.